This is Here Before, Here Now, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Here Before, Here Now. Joining me today is Aliyah Chavez. I met Aliyah several years ago when she was a student at Stanford. I was working in Albuquerque at the time as the morning news anchor for a station there, and she had reached out to me because she had also wanted to go into the field of broadcasting and being a journalist. Well, fast forward years later, and she is now a national news anchor for ICT Newscast, which is Indian Country Today newscast. So I want to say thank you so much for being here. It's pretty incredible to see your journey and how far you've come. That's pretty crazy, right?
It is really crazy. Thank you for having me, Colton. Believe it or not, that was my first time ever being inside of a newsroom was when I visited you at the NBC affiliate in Albuquerque.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? So I remember, I think it was either a Facebook message or an email that you had mentioned, reached out to me saying, hey, I really want to do this. I'm from the Santo Domingo Pueblo, which is one of the native tribes in New Mexico. And of course, being from the Navajo Nation, I always want to help elevate other native voices. So reaching out to me was incredible. Thank you so much for doing that. And I'm glad to see you doing so well. Tell us what you're doing right now with your career.
Sure. Well, I'm the anchor of the ICT Newscast, and if you haven't heard of us before, we're a 30-minute weekday newscast that airs on different PBS stations all around the country, and we're also on in Australia and in some parts of Canada. And our reporting really focuses on Indigenous communities, so that could be Native American communities, Native Hawaiian communities, Alaska Native communities, and there's really never been a newscast like ours before. I think when you turn on the local news, you get all of the news of the day. But for Native Americans, there's really never been a specific place to turn it on and hear only about Indigenous issues.
When you do that, what's the reception you get from people in tribal communities or Indigenous communities throughout the world?
I would say that the reaction is overwhelmingly positive. It really is so heartwarming to hear some of the stories. I've heard everything from, there's actually a woman who lives in my village, and she hugged me. She saw me at a community event, and she hugged me, and she said, I never thought that I would see news about Indigenous communities on TV before. And that was just so special. But I also hear other types of reactions from policymakers, from federal officials who now come on our show very regularly because they know that there is absolutely a appetite for news about Native Americans. And I think one of my reporting one part of my reporting that I've really focused on has been about politics. And so it has been really heartwarming to see that a lot of these lawmakers can't ignore Indigenous communities, and that Indigenous communities are really important for things like elections, which we know is coming up very, very soon.
When it comes to Indigenous communities, what kind of stories are they wanting to see, not with just your newscasts, but really all over?
I would say that it's very wide-ranging. Every time that we run segments on things like fashion or music or art, people really love those segments. I know that right now in Hollywood, there's been a huge push on shows like Reservation Dogs or Spirit Rangers on Netflix. So it's been a really exciting time to cover entertainment. And then on the politics side, there also, like I just mentioned, has been such an appetite for news about policy. So I'd say that it spans the gamut of issues.
So take me back to before the time you were a national news anchor, right? When did you feel like you wanted to go into the field of journalism, storytelling?
I think that's such a great question. I grew up in the community of Giwa Pueblo, as you mentioned, which is one of the native tribes in New Mexico. And growing up, I never saw anyone on TV who looked like me. And I think that when that happens to you, it's really hard to see yourself in those kinds of positions. And I happened to be home on I think it was a winter break, and I had seen you. And my aunt at the time, she watches all of the local news. She goes, I think there's this Navajo guy on TV. And I said, no way. There's no way. And we always joke as Native people, right? As soon as you see another Native, it's like, oh, they're Native for sure.
Yeah.
So that was initially how I had found you.
Wow.
And I thought when I was in journalism school, your professors tell you, reach out to people, call people, email people. And so I cold emailed you. And when I got that response, I was like, wow, he responded. And I would say that was a big push for me to really pursue broadcasting. But if there was a specific moment, I would have to say that it was in college. As many colleges and universities do, they have certain requirements. And at Stanford, we had a writing requirement. So I was looking through the list of courses, and I thought, there's this reporting and writing the news class. Let me just take that and see what happens. And on my very first lecture, it was like a light bulb that just went off in my head. I absolutely knew that news was what I wanted to do. And I remember at the time, my professor had assigned a huge list of readings. And I actually went to her and I said, I loved all these readings so much. Can you give me more? And so that's how I really knew, like, I was hooked. It did not feel like work to me. It did not feel like classwork. It felt like something that just really interested me.
Wow, that is such an incredible story. And, for you to mention that I played a little part of it, I'm floored. I'm like, oh my gosh, but you're right. You do want to see people who are in the fields that you're interested in doing those things, because then it gives you the sort of, well, if they can do it, then I can do it.
Absolutely. And I think even pushing the needle forward, when you look at network news, you're looking at the big affiliates like NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox. There aren't any Native American correspondents. There aren't any Native American anchors. And I think for Native kids to grow up and maybe see someone who looks like them on that kind of stage, there is a lot of work to be done in order to get there.
Wow. So taking me back to your Pueblo, what's it like?
I love my community. I was born and raised in Pueblo, as I mentioned, and I was raised by my grandparents for a long part of my life. And my grandfather was a very respected tribal leader, both in ceremony, but also he was a veteran.
Mm-hmm.
And then my grandmother really was just a traditional Pueblo grandma. She taught me a lot of the skills of, how to make tortillas and how to cook and clean. And I just really loved growing up in my community. I always loved that a lot of my family has been artists. And I've also loved that in my community where I'm raised, there really is this value of kinship. So I really grew up thinking like my aunts and uncles were like my extended parents, and my cousins were like my siblings. And so I really loved growing up like that.
I was lucky enough to be able to come out for a feast day one day at Santo Domingo Pueblo. And we should let our viewers and listeners know that the Pueblos are in New Mexico. Do you know, would you care to share a little bit about the history of how many Pueblos there are and how they're related?
Sure. So there's 19 pueblos in New Mexico. And if you look at a map, there is the Rio Grande River. And most of the pueblos are located alongside the river. We know that historically there are estimates that there were hundreds of pueblos. But with Spanish colonization, now there's only 19 in New Mexico. And there's one in Texas, in Isleta del Sur. And what's really funny is my husband is the executive director of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which essentially is the body that creates policy on behalf of the governors to advance to state and federal lawmakers. So both of us work really in service of both of our communities.
That's incredible. And that's what I was going to get to. When I was out there for one of the feast days, it was just so amazing, number one, to see so many people come out and so many people just like, hey, come to my house and let me feed you. And that was my experience. And when I was in New Mexico, so many pueblos actually invited me out to theirs as well over the years. And, for whatever reason, some I could attend, some I couldn't. But it's just it's definitely great to be accepted like that into the community, and to see that, they're still thriving and still doing things, to help advance, Indigenous policy and things like that is great to see.
I agree. I actually got married in February, and my husband's from Jemez Pueblo, so we're about 45 minutes away from each other. So in a lot of ways, I'm also learning about his community. His people speak an entirely different language. They have different customs than I do. So it's been a really welcoming experience so far. People are very eager to say, this is how we do things, or come eat at my house. So I'm experiencing the other side of that too.
Oh my gosh, I miss Pueblo bread so much. You know, when you're driving down the interstate and you see people off to the side selling, I always stop to grab a couple. And that's something that I can't find here in Phoenix. You're based here in Phoenix now. Is there a place, have you found this?
I haven't. I'm very lucky. My mom lives out in Apache Junction.
Okay, all right. So you got like the in.
Yeah, every time I
come
want
to her
something.
house.
Yeah, come over. She'll be happy to have you.
So when it comes to, New Mexico, it's such a huge place of your foundation, right? I spent time there too as well, and I do miss it, especially now because it's hatch chili season. So this morning on our air, and this will air after this day, obviously, but it just brought me back to those moments. Do you frequently go back?
I do. I think that it's really important to maintain a connection to my culture. So I try to be as involved as I can. I think that it brings me a lot of spiritual grounding in order to, sit in ceremony or listen to the songs, or even just being in my family home. Most of my family speaks our native language, Charis. And I think there's just something so overwhelmingly positive about sitting there and hearing your language spoken. And as you know, being a news anchor is not easy. It comes with a lot of trauma. We have to talk about people dying. We have to talk about really scary things in the world. So I think being able to be grounded like that is really important.
When it comes to how you maintain those cultural ties, I know for me it does take effort, right? Because I'm in Phoenix. I do live pretty close to my mom, who is very traditional. She speaks Navajo, and she is always telling me how to do things the right way, or the things I'm not supposed to be doing most often. But I have a son now, right? And I'm going to have another child pretty soon. She could be here right now if we're listening to this at a certain time. But keeping those connections alive and part of the daily life, it can be challenging, especially if you're hundreds of miles away from the community.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to lean on. Especially for you, how wonderful is that your children get to have their Navajo grandma teach them the ways of your people. I love that for you.
Yeah, it's so cool. And it's also very I'm always searching for things there's this event that's happening, or, especially during the pandemic when a lot of things went remote, there was a lot of things that we're trying to introduce, especially Navajo culture, these classes or, storytelling for children. And that's one of the things that I do miss seeing because I haven't seen much of that happening virtually anymore. And it's always so much easier to do things away instead of having to go someplace to do it. So, that's just kind of been my experience. How else do you feel like you keep connected?
I actually think that Phoenix has a really blossoming and vibrant Native community, and I really enjoyed getting to know the communities around the Phoenix area. I think if you are driving down the road, most people see the signs when you're going to Scottsdale of the Pima Maricopa Indian community, or you see the casinos, but there's so much more to the Native communities here than that. I recently had the opportunity to go cover a story at the Salt River tribe, and it was amazing. It was about these elders who over COVID, they couldn't go and be physically active, so they started a chair volleyball league, and so that league turned into a giant tournament where teams from all around the state of Arizona and even California are playing chair volleyball. And it was such an amazing opportunity to go and speak with the elders of this community, and they were just telling me this is the highlight of our year. We just really love playing chair volleyball. So I've really enjoyed getting to know the Native communities around this area.
What are some of the challenges in covering Native communities?
There's a lot.
Right.
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest challenges is really educating non-Native people about Indigenous communities. I know that some of the most frequent questions that I get asked are, do you prefer to be called Native American or American Indian or Indigenous? It's really having people understand who we are and why our issues matter. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think through journalists like you and I, we're really trying to push the needle forward in terms of Native communities and what matters to them. So I would say that that's one big area of improvement. But the other big challenge is really that there are 570 plus tribal nations in the United States. I cover these communities every day, and even I don't know all 570 tribal nations. And it's really easy to paint this perfect picture of, you know, the Navajos do it this way, the Pueblos do it this way, the Paiutes do it this way. But the reality is that there's a lot of nuance, and there's also, like any community, there are people who feel certain ways. We know that Native communities vary in terms of political parties. So there's a lot of Democrats, there's a lot of Republicans, but there's also a lot of independents as well. So it really is just trying to be an expert on so many communities and also reporting the news at the same time.
So how do you cover all 570? I know it's impossible, but do you have people set up across the country, or is this something that people are focused on specific regions?
Yeah, so ICT has various bureaus across the country. We have one in Washington, D.C. We have one in Anchorage, Alaska, and then we just opened one in Missoula, Montana. And of course, we have our Phoenix bureau, which is our headquarters. And then we also have reporters and producers who are based remotely throughout the country. And we're really lucky because so many of them are Native American themselves. And I think, I feel like I always have a really good pulse on Pueblo communities because, I mean, so many Native people use Facebook. So if I log on Facebook, right, I'm going to know all the gossip of the day.
Right.
Yeah. And they have their own Facebook groups of their own communities. So I feel like we do a pretty good job of just trying to get a pulse of what's going on out there.
Do you feel like there's a weight on your shoulders because you are Native and you have this platform to, tell all these stories?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think when you're in a position like this where there aren't a lot of Indigenous broadcasters, the weight is heavy. You want to do a good job every single day. And it's really difficult. I think as humans, sometimes we wake up in the morning and we're just not, it's just not our day, right? It's just, you slept weird, or mentally you're feeling funny, or you're hungry, or whatever it is. But when you show up in that studio, it's like you got to give 150% every day, rain or shine. And so it is a lot of pressure, but it's a good pressure, I would say, and it's one that I really don't take lightly.
What's one of the most favorite stories that one of your favorite stories that you've covered in the past few years?
That is a really hard question. I would say that one of my favorite stories to cover was about a grandmother who was Navajo, actually. And over the pandemic, she wasn't able to sell her jewelry. She makes earrings and necklaces. And before COVID, she was selling them at flea markets or at fairs. And of course, when COVID happened, she couldn't go do that. So her granddaughter set up an online store for her to sell her crafts. And they started posting pictures of her, of what they were going to post online. And all of a sudden, online, she became a huge sensation. She is just sort of like this iconic Navajo grandma with the skirt and just the face and the bun. And just when you look at her, you're like, oh yeah, she's such a beautiful elder.
Right?
Yeah. And so when they posted her store, she sold out in one day.
That's amazing.
And so I got to talk to her, and she only spoke Navajo, so I was having her granddaughter translate. But she had told me that she had never made that much money in one day before.
Wow.
And so I asked her, you have all this money. What are you going to do with it now? And she goes, I'm going to give some to my grandkids, but I'm also going to go to KFC and buy a bucket of chicken.
Aww, that's so sweet.
Which was amazing. And I just really loved getting to know her. And I think elders are such a cornerstone for so many people. So that was really a delight to be able to tell her story.
I know, especially during the pandemic, elders were being hit hard with COVID. So a lot of communities tried to rally together and bring that message of stay home to protect them, because they are the knowledge keepers. You know, they're the ones who, many of them are fluent speakers, many of them know the stories and all that. So whenever you meet a native elder, you always just want to give them a hug, or say thank you so much for imparting your knowledge down to the people, because that's what connects us to the culture.
Absolutely. And I think over COVID, we heard of so many elders who didn't have that support system, and they were feeding themselves and taking care of themselves. And I think we were made so much more aware that sometimes elders in our community are really lonely. And so I think that was also another highlight for me, was to showcase this vibrant and really awesome elder.
Yeah. When it comes to you, what's next? I mean, right now you've got this great job. You've got this. I mean, does Aliyah Chavez take over the world one day?
I'm not sure what's next.
Yeah.
I think in the most immediate future, I really am enjoying telling stories about Indigenous communities. But I know that at the heart of who I am, I'm also a journalist. So I would be really excited one day to tell stories about other communities. And I think that would be really exciting for me.
On that, do you find that obviously what we do is really important, but when it comes to telling specific community stories, do you feel like sometimes that you're just branded as doing those stories? I mean, for me, when I was what I do, I always pitch these stories, right? But then all these stories come to me, so I'm like, okay, I have a lot of these stories to tell.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to feel that way, especially when I'm sure between you and I, we can probably count the Indigenous broadcasters on both of our hands. There's not too many. So I think it is really easy when you don't even have the numbers on your side to feel that way.
When it comes to all these other issues that are coming out right now, when we talk about, boarding schools and other Indigenous communities, when it comes to environmental rights. It seems like, for me, maybe it's because I'm in it and I am in this broadcast industry, I see more of it, more stories about it coming out. Do you feel that's the same case?
Absolutely. I've seen so many stories on boarding schools. And if anyone's listening to this and they don't know what it is, essentially hundreds of years ago, the federal government was taking Native American children and putting them into boarding schools. And there's this historic phrase called "kill the Indian and save the man." And essentially they were trying to assimilate Native American children into dominant culture and completely strip away their Native identity. And we've seen the repercussions of that through generations. And I've spoke to so many survivors who either were taken to boarding schools themselves, or their parents or their grandparents were taken. And when you hear these stories, I mean, my gosh, it's impossible to see how this wasn't affecting people today. You absolutely cannot ignore that boarding schools are affecting Native American people today. And more mainstream news organizations are making themselves aware to this history, and hopefully more Americans are hearing about it too.
One of my favorite stories that I covered when I was in Albuquerque was highlighting NACA, the school out there. They teach mostly Indigenous students, and they are using the old boarding school facility that was once there. So I was talking to the teachers, and I was talking to the executive director of it, who all shared the same sentiment. This was a place where all of our ancestors and our family members came to be stripped of their language and of their culture. But now it's become a place where we embrace it and we are teaching it to our children. And when I left that site, when I saw on the evening news that day, I was just like, I'm so glad that the story is being told, because not many people are aware of any of these issues that Native communities have faced.
I actually was recently in Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada, and Canadians have the same thing, but they call them residential schools. And over there in Canada, I was just so blown away. everyone knew about them. And the color of the residential school I guess movement is orange. And as I was driving along the streets of Winnipeg, I noticed like orange flags in people's houses and even people wearing orange pins. And I was so blown away because I'm like, wow, people really know about this as an everyday occurrence in Canada. And so I think the United States has a lot of work in order to get there. But there is some movement, at least on the federal level. I know that there are a number of U.S. senators that have introduced pieces of legislation that would essentially create government funding for the investigation of these boarding schools. And we know that Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who is from Laguna Pueblo, she's Native American, has really been leading a lot of these efforts too.
What do you think about these stories that are coming out right now, like these? We talked, I think a few months ago, we did a story where Secretary Haaland came to one of the reservations close by, and hearing from these survivors of boarding schools, like, what do you think it does to the masses when they hear about this happening? It's part of history, but some people don't want to listen to it.
I hope that it touches them. I know that it is really difficult for these survivors to recount what happened to them. And I think giving them the space and the respect and the validation of what they went through is really important. I haven't seen a person who was learning about this for the first time, but I imagine just like learning about other really horrible things that have happened in the world, things like the Holocaust or just different horrible events that have happened. I know that it touches all so deeply. We're humans, and I think that we can really connect to each other. And once we learn about the trauma we faced, hopefully we can make that connection.
So you're in a position now where someone is watching you. Has anyone reached out and said, hey, I want to do what you do?
Yes, and it's been so amazing.
Uh-huh.
It made me think of you and our experience together. I was at the Indigenous Journalists Association conference, and at the University of Kansas, they recently launched a newscast called Good Morning Indian Country.
Uh-huh.
And I believe it broadcasts through the state of Kansas, but it's a college-run newsroom. And a few of their anchors have reached out to me and said, will you help me with delivery? Will you help me with scripts? And a few of them were even talking about producing, because I think so often you turn on the news and you see the anchor, but there's an entire team of people behind the scenes.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, who help. And so I think, anchors are great, but we also need producers, and we need, camera operators. And there's a lot of behind the scenes work that happens. So it has been really great to hear from them, and I'm really excited to be working with them.
I love how when you came here to the studio, I gave you a tour of the station, and you were also kind of blown away, like, oh my gosh, there's so many people here. Yes, these are all the people that work together to help do what we do, put things on the air. It's pretty incredible. We couldn't do it without them.
Oh, absolutely not. Even when I'm anchoring my show, you don't see phones on the desk when you're anchoring, right? Like somebody comes and brings me my little stool so that I can put my phone there, and in between a commercial break, I can check the time or I can check something. It's all the small things and all the big things too.
Wow. Is there anything that you want to leave our listeners and viewers with? Any parting words or any questions for me?
I will say thank you so much for having me. And I would just let our audiences know to uplift Indigenous journalists and to uplift Indigenous media. I think that it is so important when an Indigenous person is reporting on their own communities, like they're doing it with the most respect and the most expertise that they have, and you're not going to get news anywhere else. We know our communities best. So yeah, that's all I would say today.
Definitely. There is that nuance that comes with having that perspective and reporting on certain things and culture and just ties. and all that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if anyone's listening to this
Yeah.
and has any native food suggestions for Colton and I
Oh, yes.
in Phoenix, let us know.
Yeah, well, let's see. I mean, of course, there's the Fry Bread House. There's a Hope's Fry Bread in Mesa that I've also gone to. And there was this food truck that's always at the Herd, and that place is so good as well. So, and that name is escaping me, and I wish I could remember it off the top of my head.
Well, you're so lucky because the Fry Bread House is a hop, skip, and a jump away from here.
It's just down the street, yes.
Yeah. I always joke with my family. I say, oh, I really want another fry bread, or I really want another this, but I have to be on TV tomorrow.
Oh my gosh, no, it's very heavy.
It is heavy, but it's good.
Yes, absolutely. All right, Aliyah, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Here Before, Here Now, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.